I know as attorney for Lyndon Johnson that he murdered John Kennedy. He murdered John Kennedy to become president and to avoid prison, and there is no doubt in my mind.
Lyndon Baines Johnson. Born in 1908, he grew up in a comfortable middle-class home in Johnson City. At an early age, Lyndon showed a keen interest in politics. From the beginning, he was driven by a determination to win, whatever the cost.
In a word, he was ruthless. There wasn't anything he wouldn't do to get what he wanted, regardless of what it was. And probably the best example would be in 1948 when he was running for the Senate. And he was running against a man named Coke Stevenson. And the election was very, very close, a very small number of votes, which forced a recount. And once they did the recount, they found out a 201 vote error in a little place called Alice, Texas. And eventually they found out that the 201 votes had been added. 1 for Stevenson, 200 for LBJ. As a result, he won by 87 votes, and he was nicknamed Landslide Lyndon.
But the real name, the name used in the backwards that didn't appear in the newspapers, was Lion Lyndon. And that stuck with him the rest of his life.
That rigged ballot became the template for a political career based on bribery and corruption. The full extent of Johnson's criminal activity only began to unravel 11 years after his death. In 1984, at this courthouse in Franklin, Texas, a former Johnson business associate, Billy Celestes, appeared before a grand jury.
According to Billy Celestes, there were 8 murders perpetrated on the part of Lyndon Johnson. The first name was a man named Douglas Kinzer. That was followed by a number of men involved in Estes businesses who were corrupt, and they were all killed with carbon monoxide. Josepha Johnson's name is listed on this Justice Department document. That's Lyndon Johnson's sister. So Estes is accusing the Vice President of the United States of murdering his own sister. And the 8th name listed is the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And then there is a promise of knowing more. And if Billy Celestes is telling the truth, and there's every reason to believe he is, it gives you an idea of the depth of the corruption and the ruthlessness of Lyndon Johnson.
After becoming a senator in 1948, Johnson developed an unrivaled power base in Washington, using his forceful personality, political skills, and corruption. He established himself as one of the most influential men in the nation, but as vice president to Kennedy, he lost much of that authority. By 1961, his past was catching up with him. In Texas, Henry Marshall, a local agricultural official, had begun investigating one of Johnson's illegal sources of funding. Working out of these offices in Bryan, Texas, Marshall had become aware of Billy Celestes' misappropriation of federal cotton allotment funds. Attempts to buy off Marshall had failed, and his investigations were beginning to threaten the vice president himself.
Billy Celestes became worried, Lyndon Johnson became worried, and some of them got together and decided, what are we going to do with Henry Marshall? So on one particular day, according to Billy Celestes, Cliff Carter, an aide to Lyndon Johnson, the vice president of the United States, and Malcolm Wallace got together. And finally, Lyndon made the statement, get rid of him.
On June the 3rd, 1961, Henry Marshall failed to return home. An extensive search was made of the family farm near Franklin, Texas. His only son, Don, was 11 years old at the time and remembers that day well.
My uncle found him on the second attempt when he went out to the place. He was in a very remote location, probably about 3/4 of a mile off the road. My mother had this stone placed here in order to mark the spot. The truck had blood around the sides of it. The side on the passenger side had a dent in the fender behind the passenger door, and that's apparently where my father's head was knocked into the side of the truck, and he had his eye damaged at that point. There were a number of yopon bushes that had been broken, and the gun was laying beside the body, and pretty much nothing else could be seen except signs of a struggle.
Local officials immediately ruled it a suicide, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
He had been shot 5 times with a bolt-action rifle. He had enough carbon monoxide in his lungs to cause him to pass out at the time he died. There was no effort made to collect any evidence or preserve the crime scene. They had pretty much determined in their minds that this was going to be a suicide. When Billy Saul Estes testified before the grand jury in Franklin, he implicated Cliff Carter and Malcolm Wallace as the people that were most involved in my father's murder. Wallace being the trigger man and Cliff Carter being the one who arranged for the murder. I'm firmly convinced that Malcolm Wallace was the killer of my father. Who that would have aided, probably political power behind everything. Johnson would have been aided more than anyone else.
The grand jury concluded Henry Marshall in 1961 was murdered, which means in simple language that the grand jury believed Billy Saul Estes when he told them that Lyndon Johnson had ordered Malcolm Wallace to kill Henry Marshall.
But Johnson's dark dealings were not confined to Texas. In late summer 1963, one of his long-term partners in crime was about to be exposed for corruption by a Senate investigation.
Bobby Baker was the secretary to the Senate majority. Basically, he was the secretary for the Senate, and he was one of Lyndon Johnson's closest associates. And everything that Lyndon Johnson wanted to perpetrate, he had Bobby's help. Essentially, if somebody wanted to get a military contract and they wanted influence of Lyndon Johnson to help them, they had to pay off Bobby Baker, who would then pay off Lyndon Johnson. It's the world of bribes. Bobby Baker was involved in a call girl service. He was involved in real estate scams. He was involved in dealings with organized crime. He was in dealings with oil men, particularly Clint Murchison, an oil millionaire from Texas. So as a result of all this, Bobby Baker was in big trouble. And with a little bit of inspiration on the part of the Kennedys that they could get Bobby Baker to talk, Lyndon was all done. Lyndon Baines Johnson, if Robert Kennedy had his way, would not only not be on the 1964 ticket as the vice presidential candidate, but he would go to jail for the corruption that he was involved with.
Although Johnson faced political extinction at the hands of the Kennedys, he had powerful allies with their own agendas that threatened the president, as researcher Gregory Burnham explains.
And people would think that he had no enemies. He was so popular. He smiled. He appeared happy. Everyone loved him worldwide. But what people don't seem to understand is behind the scenes, he was making changes, and he was making them decisively, and he was taking some very, very daring steps. He was committed to pull out of Vietnam. By October, he had signed a document, an SAM 263, to that effect. 1,000 troops home by Christmas, and all personnel out of Vietnam by 1965. But that wasn't very good for the military-industrial complex. His abolishing the Central Intelligence Agency, pulling their teeth, holding them to task, back to why they were originally created by Truman. Their original mandate by law is only to coordinate intelligence, not to create the Bay of Pigs. NSAM 55 told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the CIA no longer can do that, and any military operation has to come directly from them to the president, period. That kind of a document really causes problems